Well, today we're going to get into some possibly heavy topics, unlike the usually light stuff we deal with, addiction and drug death rates. I guess we could call today Believing the Unbelievable, the reality that can't be acknowledged. And I might even touch on a political topic or two today. One thing that you and I often discuss is how the leading lights in the field, including reforming lights, believe that we sort of have a solution to the drugs and addiction problem. Mm-hmm. And the only problem we have is that not enough people believe in it, and their job is to convince more people to believe in it.
Right. The idea is we have the idea, we know what to do, we just need to scale it. Why don't more people understand this?
Well put. Now, in general, it's a little tough to estimate addiction rates in America for a number of reasons. I mean, we're not doing clinical assessments of everybody in America. And then somebody will always point out, well, you're talking about opioids, but what about meth? And what about alcohol? And then, of course, we can branch out into all kinds of other areas.
Non-drug areas, if we wanted to, if we were really being thoughtful about it.
And a lot of people are very concerned and impressed with those. We've spoken about media addictions, electronic addictions, which some people believe are they're recognized by ICD-11 and they're in the form of gaming, and some people believe they're overwhelming the current generation of young people. But one number that's very concrete that can't be denied are the death numbers, and the death numbers from drugs have increased every year since 2000, with the tick back of 4% in 2018, but they've resurged now with a vengeance. And the last full year's worth is by the CDC is September of 2020, and the preceding year, and there were 87,000 deaths compared to in 2018, there were 67,000 deaths. That's a remarkable increase in annual death rates. And people argue, our good colleagues and friends argue, well, MAT, medication-assisted treatment, hasn't been deployed broadly enough, but MAT is everywhere in America now. You can't go anywhere without being aware of it, every single person, and it's backed by both the Drug Policy Alliance and the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which might be considered the left and right wings of drug policy. So everybody's on board with it, and then we're faced with the question, why are people dying in droves? And then the annual death rate has roughly quadrupled due to drugs since 2000. Now, we often, West Virginia is the leading state by a ton currently in drug deaths. In 2017, the chair of public health was a man named Dr. Gupta. He studied every single drug death in 2017. If you're a male between the ages of 35 to 54 with less than a high school education, you're single and you're working in a blue collar industry, you pretty much are at a very, very high risk of overdosing. And I believe, I haven't totally checked this, Gupta's now working for the Biden administration, and I believe his job is to suppress painkillers. I believe that's the job he has. And what he's talking about, of course, is a population of people. He's not talking about painkillers. And you and I and much of America have talked about deaths of despair. I mean, opioids are one avenue for those deaths. Alcohol and cirrhosis and suicide are another.
Rahul Gupta, who you're talking about, if for people who don't know, which you've begun to describe, he was tasked to give a parsimonious, objective view of the landscape of drug-related deaths. And of course, he came up with, well, I'm guessing you'll probably go over the figures and the comorbidities that occur, much of which have nothing to do with drugs. They have more to do with lifestyle. And so I didn't realize he was part of the Biden administration, I'm embarrassed to say. And that is crazy that it was this like beacon of light for me. And I said, oh, there's a reasonable person who could maybe help paint a more realistic narrative.
Who knows more about it? He examined every single death in the state with the most deaths. He knows more than any human being could know.
And so against his own best work, he's now involved in a campaign for single solution, magic bullet solutions that, well, you'll talk about it, but they obviously do
I
more harm
think
than good.
getting down to what this session is about, how do beliefs overcome reality? I mean, nobody, it's almost as though Goop was holding the hand of every person that died. I mean, they had to die first before he studied them. But the people who run ONDCP, Office of National Drug Control Policy, they don't know about individual deaths. Coroners know about individual deaths. And they examine dead bodies. But at a larger level, people like Maya Szalavitz and your namesake, Zach Siegel, and even largely DPA, they don't know about who's dying. That's not sort of their business. They operate at 20,000 feet. And my argument is those deaths are kind of invisible. I mean, we really don't know. We have no idea of what the lives of people are like in Appalachia. I mean, the movie was just released. Help me out, Zach.
Yep,
the guy,
I know what you're talking about, but I can't remember right now. Hillbilly Elegy.
Hillbilly Elegy. And he, by the way, we could devote a whole session to him. He's there's a movie that was put out. It didn't do well. And it's not well done. He emerged, he's actually from Ohio, but they had a direct link to Kentucky. His family was from Kentucky. And so, you don't think Ohio hillbillies, how's that work? Mm. And he escaped all of that. His mother was constantly involved with drugs and mental health issues. And in a way, his grandmother, who's sort of the star of the movie, you sort of think she was responsible for that. But then do you know his name? I'm blocking his name. Who's the author of Hillbilly?
J.D. Vance.
Was raised by his grandmother, and then he went to Ohio State and then Yale Law School, and he became kind of a genius. Mm. And he's now regularly appears on Fox News, and he's an up by your bootstraps guy, because he's saying, wait a second, who had it worse than me? I didn't have a mother, and his father was absent. And, I went to Yale Law School, for God's sake. So, obviously there are flaws in that argument. Not everybody's a genius. I'm sympathetic to stories like that. I like stories like that.
It's funny that Obama was the archetype of a hero that he followed to chase his dream of picking himself up by the bootstraps. But now he appears on Fox News, who could be more critical of Obama.
And he came back to Ohio. He was in San Francisco. He was some kind of, I guess he became rich doing some kind of whatever those guys do, investment thing. Mm-hmm. And he came back to Ohio and he announced he was going to attack the drug death situation. And I read that. He wrote an op-ed in the New York Times. And I said, wonder what he's going to do. And it doesn't say one thing about what he's going to do. And now I believe he's talking about, running for political office, which is fine. But that central issue in his own life, well, I made it. And my family background was, trauma emblazoned in neon. How's that work? And how did my grandmother, who was not a good mother to my mother, improve? But those are invisible deaths. And in a way, Vance doesn't really have contact with his own old life. He appears regularly on Fox News on what's the name of that guy's show?
Is it Tucker Carlson that you're talking about?
Tucker Carlson doesn't know about life in Appalachia. So how do people avoid the topic? I mean, DPA doesn't avoid it entirely, but we've discussed this more than once. Maya Szalavitz recovered in her early 20s from a heavy-duty heroin and cocaine addiction. Did the fact that she came from a well-off family and was attending Columbia University and has great intellectual skills. And she went on to Brooklyn University, which is a couple blocks from me here. Did that have anything to do with her recovery, would you think?
I'd say
And
so.
one person that we've talked about in that regard is the Congresswoman Madeline Dean, her son Harry Cunane, who've written a book, Under Our Roof, A Son's Battle for Recovery, A Mother's Battle for Her Son. 8 years ago, Madeline Dean was devastated when she learned that her son Harry Cunane had repeatedly stuck out of the house with his dad's ATM card to steal a total of $4,300. The good news, however, is he himself went to the Karen Foundation. It took a while. He recovered, and now he's a marketing outreach representative for them. How much would you guess the Karen Foundation charges annually? Monthly for a stay there, would you guess?
God, $30,000.
I would think it's beyond that. I would think it's about $40,000. And so we talked about the fact that Madeline Dean is a tremendous progressive. I admire her tremendously. She's very much focused on eating quality, and she's written a book, Under Our Roof, Our Son's Battle for Recovery, where she touts his recovery, and it only costs, a couple $100,000, for God's sake. What the hell's the matter? And of course, the best thing you can say about hillbillyology is he did it for free. So, and if you're going to rely on hundreds of thousands, we can't provide basic health care for people. So there are, can you give a quick summary? Madeline Dean is saying, wow, my son went to the Karen Foundation and he had that horrible drug problem, and I'm not minimizing it. And now he's better and he's a constructive citizen. What great treatment. How would you respond to the idea that those who go to Karen Foundation do probably better than those in West Virginia? Is it because they're so great, the treatment's so great at the Karen Foundation?
Well, you're giving me an alley-oop, but I'll dunk it. The conditions which bring people to be able to afford the kind of treatment that's offered by the Karen Foundation in Philadelphia generally have better outcomes, no matter what they do. So you can throw whatever you want into the wind about what strategies you're going to use to help improve your kids or your family members or your life. If you come from a place with enough money, enough resources, something about having that money and resources is going to help you along one way or another.
And Maya Szalavitz went to a 12 Hazleton type place up in Westchester. And then she came back and she stopped using drugs, and you think, and she herself was committed early on in her early 20s to that 12-step approach. But she's a smart woman. She said, well, when you think about it, the fact that I, come from a kind of an intact family with a lot of resources, I quickly got a college education. I might have done all right no matter what. She's split on that. So some people do die in privileged situations. And we're talking about death today. And last week, Colt Brennan, who was a former University of Hawaii star quarterback, died at 37. Brennan had a NCAA record for touchdown passes in 2006. He was a national star. There's just a quote, he's dead. They did an obituary. I love the game so much that it controlled my whole life, Mr. Brennan said in the 2007 interview with the New York Times. He died last week in 2021. My whole life revolved around football. When I did good in football, I was happy. If I wasn't doing good in football, I was miserable. I don't know that we're going to go down that road right this second, but you and I could do a whole thing on what's the difference between having a purpose in life and having a resort in life that's not necessarily, you can play football there's only 20 guys in the world who are at the top of the professional football quarterback Luke.
Mm-hmm.
And there are tons of gifted athletes who don't make that leap. And so the question is, how do you go from being successful in one thing to leading a successful life? And if you're counting on being a superstar in football, baseball, or basketball, that's not in and of itself a life solution and life purpose.
Right. So the distinction you're making is, so he had a relationship with football. I like using those terms.
I like it too.
Which you've inspired. And there's a big difference between using that relationship to escape from life and using that relationship to enhance or build on life. And, you could be obsessed and perfect and great at it. You can feel like it's giving you a purpose, but the belief system around that matters, and how you incorporate it into life matters.
And so I hate to resort to my family. My daughter Anna was in high school, was a great sort of actress star. And my wife then said, Anna's not going to end up being whoever, the top 5 or 10 women actresses are. That's not going to happen. For one thing, you have to be incredibly beautiful. But my ex-wife and I weren't worried because Anna learned a competence lesson. And the competence lesson translated, she started writing for people. Maybe someday she'll write for a superstar actress, but she's doing okay. We're back to Colt Brennan. Some of those football players have great names. So last week, Mr. Brennan was admitted to Hoag Hospital in Newport Beach after he ingested a substance believed to contain fentanyl. We've heard this story before.
Yeah.
It contained fentanyl, it contained other things. Colt Brennan had recently finished a 4-month course of treatment at a rehab center and was trying to recover from a substance use disorder. So he's 37. He was a super duper star 15 years ago. 4 months in Hoag Hospital. That's going on $250,000. And he comes out and he dies that weekend. So to put it mildly, treatment wasn't entirely a success. Now, there's a DPA, Zach Siegel, Maya Szalavitz explanation for people dying after they come out of rehab. Let me just mention a couple other examples. Mr. Brennan tried to enroll in a detox facility over the weekend. He had just gotten out of one. I guess he could live there. And some people tried that, but it was full. After that, he met with some people at a hotel room and ingested the drugs. Now, that story isn't the first time that we're telling a story of a privileged person who died. And they went to one of these fancy rehabs. So, 2 big examples that you and I have discussed. Amy Winehouse checked back into rehab in the spring of 2011. Emerging in May, she was found dead in her home on July 23rd. So she survived rehab by 2 months. That fall, the coroner announced that she died of accidental alcohol poisoning. Her blood alcohol level was over 0.40. You're going to harm yourself when your blood's almost 50% alcohol.
Good God.
She wasn't a big girl. And another super famous, most people don't know who Colt Brennan is anymore, but Glee's Corey Monteith overdosed on heroin and alcohol in July 2013. The star was found dead in a Vancouver hotel room Saturday. In March, a couple months before, Glee cast and crew urged Monteith to accompany doctors to a rehab facility, which had been arranged by the show. And on April 26, he had completed his treatment. How does Maya explain those deaths and say we should deal with them? How do you understand those deaths?
let's see. Let me give the best interpretation of Maya's argument, and to some extent, there are elements of great truth in them. So someone will go to these rehab facilities that preach abstinence-only treatment, and these people are away from their substance of choice for so long that they feel that when they leave, first of all, the treatment's done no good for them. They've done nothing to help them in their normal life routines. So they just go away on a vacation somewhere and are not allowed to use a drug. Maybe not based on their own interest. It's not an idea that they generated. It's kind of forced upon them. And then they leave, and the urgency, the yearning to do a drug doesn't go away. So they get drugs again, and because their tolerance is not high enough now, because they have not been using drugs regularly, the whatever drugs they're using are so potent that now they overdose. They want to seek the high that they used to get, use the same amount of drugs that they used to use, but now their tolerance is not equipped for that, so they overdose and they die. And I think that the ameliorative thing that Maya might want to throw in there is, well, imagine if he was just on a maintenance drug to keep his tolerance at some level, so that when he left, that this wouldn't happen. I think that's a good version of their argument.
And in addition, Zach Siegel, DPA, and Maya would say, well, you should put him on buprenorphine or Suboxone,
like
so
in treatment,
after treatment,
in anticipation,
to maintain him. He should go away with a prescription,
right?
So he won't be taking whatever he finds.
Well, I think their argument might be, I know Zach better than I know Maya. I know Maya too. Zach and I we've gone to conferences and we've stayed at the same Airbnb before. We've had these discussions, and so I'm pretty familiar with his arguments. I think he might even say, I don't know about Maya, that person should be prescribed something like buprenorphine or methadone before entering the treatment, while they're in treatment, so that they just prepare them for leaving with.
Okay, it's the same
concept, absolutely.
And there are data to show. I mean, if you're getting a prescription from a reputable source, you're highly unlikely to die. Well, unless you screw with what you're taking.
Right. and that's the element of truth, I would say. That the logic makes sense. I mean, it's not crazy talk.
There are data to show. So then and that didn't happen with Colt Brennan, and it didn't happen with Corey Monteith. I believe we've discussed this. Amy Winehouse has prescribed tranquilizers. They'll do that sometimes to take the edge off. But a critique, the DPA drug reformer critique, is, well, they're so abstinence oriented that they can't see that a prescription for a substitute narcotic can be life preserving. And so, of course, the question that we then ask is, so now what happens? Now you're not in prison anymore. You're not in rehab. And, you may or may not continue to take the buprenorphine. And there are plenty of examples of people who were prescribed it and then died anyhow later. Whatchamacallit, forgive me, the famous actor died with buprenorphine all around him, but he was taking heroin and drinking.
Philip Seymour Hoffman?
Yes. In New York City, a couple blocks from where my daughter Anna would see her walking around the neighborhood. So you're faced with the same issue somewhere down the road. Mm-hmm. How is this human being? So how would you and I, Corey Monteith got out of rehab, and you mentioned, well, they take the same amount of drugs, and the same thing with Colt Brennan. Well, people go and hang out with the people they used to hang out with. That's what people are like. They want to have friends and companionship and be liked and loved. And it so happens that the people that they hang out with take drugs, which is sort of how they got there. How would you, as a coach, as a counselor, as a helper, how would you prepare a person who's leaving rehab at a minimum to make sure they don't die? And I had a rehab facility, and people went there, and we, it's conceivable. I don't want to speak for my co-owners that we might have let them drink, but you can't have a rehab in America that people are spending.
Mm-hmm.
Ours was cheap, $25,000 a month, where people are allowed to drink. That's not going to happen. And so we made it they had to talk weekly. We had a full-time person whose job it was to be in touch with people after they left.
Mm-hmm.
And, I trained that person specific. They were the people who did that job were among our best people. And I remember originally I had to explain to them, they're probably not going to abstain
mm-hmm.
whole time. So let's work from there. So, I mean, what kinds of things would you imagine if you were in a situation like that, either working with the person in rehab and preparing them for afterwards, or working with them by phone after they leave?
Your question assumes that I would be okay with sending the person to rehab, but that's because that's the situation that we were just dealt here in the example you gave.
Right.
So I'm tempted.
So you're saying you wouldn't send them to rehab in the first place.
I'm tempted to reject. Right. I'm tempted to reject that whole part of it. But in the spirit of the thought experiment, it's like at some point, if I were working with a person, maybe he left rehab, what I have in it, and at that point, I see it. One problem is that people are conditioned to believe that if they don't remain abstinent, I mean, that's the black and white. That's the binary. If you remain abstinent, good. If you don't remain abstinent, bad. You'll probably die. You're supposed to. There's no real.
And we wash our hands of it, and in the we have an elaborate relapse prevention component, which we used obviously in my rehab.
Right.
And where we explain to people, you can get off the train at any station.
Right.
This first station being, well, I went to a party and people were drinking, and then I had a beer. And the last station is you're back on the street or you're dead. That in between those two things, there's a lot of stop-way stations you can get off of.
Right. So the reality is, people leaving rehab, okay, they went to rehab. They didn't do anything to help recondition their social life, and their social life might be, that's all they have. Why? That's sort of part of the interesting thing about drug use. It's the what would you call it? Routine.
Social dimension.
It's a social dimension, but there's also a routine to it. Something that's really predictable. You see the same people, have the same sort of what's it? Nah, I can't think of the word. So
well, I mean, people are dull.
Right.
I'm a great example. I mean, people generally do the same thing.
Right. So
they sort of know how to do one thing.
Right. Right. So there's two things. One is trying to figure out what's an attractive alternative to these things. It's not like you have to ditch this. What are you going to do instead? But more like, this is something you've done. Obviously, you've sought, getting drugs is something that you've done. Obviously, you were seeking some sort of sensation or betterment or escape. And fine, fair enough. It sounds like that worked okay for you. On the other hand, let's expand that a little bit. And what else do you have? Who else do you know? What do you want to do? So there's one thing that's not overtly saying, hey, you'll probably use again, but don't worry, you can expand out. You can just acknowledge that that's happened in the past and that's done something for him, and you can expand out. Because the thing is, I think that if the idea is that if you're using, you're bad, not only are you going back to your same methodology for escaping or seeking something, but you're doing it in the dark. You don't exactly have someone to reach out to talk about it or to think out loud or to plan your life, because there's no one who really wants to listen to that. Why would you call someone to admit that you're doing something wrong if that's where the conversation's going to start?
So I told the aftercare person, no judgments.
Right.
You don't go, oh, you're using again. Doesn't. And everybody has to know that you're not going to do that. And another component of where you're going is Cole Brennan and Corey Monteith. They died almost instantly after leaving rehab.
Yeah.
So you sort of wonder, they do, exit planning when you get treatment. You're forced now, after you've had abdominal surgery, they give you a sheet of paper and it says, don't lift anything, don't walk more, whatever, and they make you sign it. I mean, it's not exactly counseling, it's more liability.
Right.
But you would think that, and we do it in life process training, you would spend a week on like, okay, he's done okay in rehab. Now you're going to go back into life. And as with Colt Brennan and Corey Monteith, what's that mean for you? And it meant, I'm going to go out with my friends and take drugs and drink.
Even doctors, though, my father just had medical issues and he had a surgery and he left, and he's not supposed to lift anything with one of his hands more than 10 pounds. And he's not supposed to do, for a couple of weeks, he wasn't supposed to do much activity or walking. But, he said things that tugged on the heartstrings of some of his doctors. And he'd say like, well, I have a granddaughter, and what if she, jumps on me or what if I want to pick her up? And I said, well, okay, if you're feeling A, B, and C well, then you could pick up your granddaughter, give her a hug, give her a squeeze. Just let's be reasonable about this.
You have to have a fallback position.
Exactly.
Everybody's not going to be perfect. That's the surest thing in life. You have to say, okay, what's step 2 before not doing the things we told you not to do?
And now forgive me because there's almost certainly going to be some psychological advanced term for this, so I'm going to use total terrestrial common sense language, which there is that scarcity belief that you can have when you're not supposed to be using, or you're not supposed to, whatever the drug was, you're not supposed to be doing it, so get it while you can get it, kind of a thing. So I'm going to have to go back to real life after this encounter with my heroin dealer, and so I might as well stock up, might as well have a killer experience, right? Well, that was not meant to be a pun, but might as well have a great experience now and do as much as I can, or, you know what I mean? And so that
you would instead say, we don't want you to do what you were doing before. I mean, we're not here to tell you can drink some or snort some cocaine, but we don't want you to, spend all night, on a bender. And here's what we want you have to get out of that situation at some point. And even if worse comes to worse and you're in a really bad situation, you can still pull out of that tailspin. And what we're conveying is self-efficacy and managing your own life, because that's out there in the world. That's all you've got.
And so
there's no direct umbilical cord. I mean,
right.
Of course, we have telephone coaching now, and everybody's getting into that. That's, the pandemic has changed therapy. And everybody sort of says, when you think about it, kind of being able to call somebody up, that works a lot better than making an appointment, a month in advance to
right.
Go downtown, get a parking ticket, and go to therapy.
Now, it's good to have someone to triangulate with. You've got your sort of people who are trying to care for you or care about you. Then you have sort of your normal style and routine with either drug dealers or people who you were hanging out with. And there's a dialectic already. But if you have some third party, first of all, it's good just to be able to get the thoughts out and talk. It's also not a horrible thing to kind of lean on that person when you're trying to describe what you're up to those people who care about you, to say, well, my professional, whatever it was, said this. So it's that way that those, let's say it's parents, a kid out of rehab, and said, well, I used again. Don't worry, I talked to this professional and we talked about how I might. It's the conversation is much more inviting.
Well, we had a kind of training program for the family,
right,
of people,
right,
where we say, we don't exactly. I mean, you've already spent $50,000. Maybe there was something that you weren't fully aware of, but we don't believe in this. Once you use, you're out of control thing.
Right. So I'll just put a pin in it. That I've just got done working with a family, and this comes up all the time, but they were their son is an adult now, but barely still a teenager. And they were talking to me about how, well, every time we've taken all of the resources away for him to be able to use, he just kind of does anyway. He'll get it fronted to him by somebody without paying, or he'll steal something and sell it and get. And so we're worried that when he comes back, he might do it again. How do we keep him from doing it? And I reflected back, but ultimately they generated the idea that, oh, I guess maybe if there's no way to get him to stop doing it by just restricting things, maybe that's just not the energy, where we want to focus our energy. Maybe we want to just focus it on keeping an open dialogue. And so they were, it didn't take much to get them to sign on to, it's quite possible that your son might use again. I mean, let's just keep up with the attractive alternatives and building a life kind of a thing that he's on. But let's have a plan for if that does happen, and maybe don't make such a huge deal out of it, the using part. Maybe make the deal out of, are you being safe? Are you sticking with your plan? Which you could do both. It's possible to have road, speed bumps along the way that either set you back or could maybe coincide with your plan. Like Carl Hart would say, there's some responsible adult drug use that could happen. So that working,
They
like you
are
say,
parents.
right?
If you're a parent, your kid hasn't always done his homework.
Right.
So Madeline Dean is shocked to learn that her son's been stealing $4,000 to use drugs. And then, you can freak out and send him to rehab, or you can say, can we talk about this? First of all, you're stealing my money. How about getting a job? You know what I mean? We're not going to let you take our money without telling us. But, what are you doing? And what's that all about? I mean, it's sort of a window into reality. But in the freak out addiction syndrome, you say, we're out of control. We can't deal with this. And then the logic becomes, let's send them to rehab. But they don't teach them how to deal with it either.
Right.
And then they get out of rehab. And somewhere along the line, a human being like, Maya Szalavitz is going to have to learn to create a social and a professional life that no longer centers around hanging out with people that use drugs. And,
So buprenorphine, methadone, there is a logic to saying, that's a predictable, reliable dose of something that someone could take, and maybe that would be helpful. And what you're saying in addition to that is fine, but at the same time, you do that for long enough, that's a stopgap, and so you run into the exact same problems. So you do that for a while, you're maintained on this drug, and then assuming nothing else changes, then what do you do then? You're just faced with the same problem, but now the person's medicated.
So everything we've said is so commonsensical. People could shut off their screens and say, but these guys are just saying the most logical things that if I didn't know anything about addiction, I would, figure out on my own. And we're getting back to the original topic, which is, why are so many people dying? And yet people are claiming such great success for our current treatment options. Why are people believing the unbelievable? And, one question we've asked is, how do, it traces back to the political question. A large segment of the American population believes that Joe Biden didn't actually win the election, and they're using all of their energy to prove that the election was stolen. And those of us in liberal New York, laugh and sneer at them. But in fact, that behavior is sort of standard human behavior. The American Psychological Association, they ask the question, why do people believe fantasies or believe the unbelievable? And they list three things: motivation, identity, and ideology combined to undermine accurate human judgment. Do those ring a bell with you? Motivation, identity, and ideology?
They ring a bell. Yeah, it seemed like important pillars.
How do those feed into even the most advanced people saying, well, obviously MAT works. We know it works. we have that little side issue that people are dying in greater numbers despite the spread of MAT. And they maintain, they're just kind of happy to adhere to that philosophy.
The ideology is there for the taking. The identity part is, if you write good prose and you understand the ideology, then you're kind of accepted. And if you're a really good writer, you could be at the top of that game. And so the idea is reinforced. We're talking about MAT here. And the idea is reinforced.
If you're and I've been at groups like this, I write about it in my memoir. I was in one in the fall of 2017. Everybody got up and said how great MAT and repressing painkiller prescriptions were, suppressing them. And every single person put up a chart in 2017 showing drug deaths in New York City and New York State were increasing. And I tried to get recognized, but I'm the fly in the ointment kind of person. Andrew Tatarsky, who I've known for decades, refused to acknowledge my presence. And my question would be, if we're doing such great stuff, and some of it was good. I mean, Denise Payon worked for the city of New York, the health commissioner who I ran into, who the mayor introduced me to. And, they have immediate response teams. That has to be good. How could that not be good?
Right.
For, giving everybody naloxone, which is, a reversal drug, that can't be anything but good. Right. And yet drug deaths are still going up. And so there's a list of things they're doing, and some are, are obvious. They're so practical, you'd be crazy not to do them. And some of them have a kickback. And the kickback that you and I are aware of is telling people you don't have the self-efficacy. The downside to MAT is conveying to people that you don't have the self-efficacy to manage your own life. And the fundamental solution to addiction and to survival is your belief that you do have that capability.
Just like with Trump and Biden, country split around 50-50 on that. The voting block is split around 50-50. So there's always going to be fuel for one side of the aisle or the other to continue pursue the ideology, because it seems like so many people are against it. We have to convince these people, or we have to oppose these people. So there goes the unwillingness to look at that chart and say, okay, you just said there's obvious life-saving measures we should take. These are obvious. We have to fight for obvious life-saving measures. And so that's good. And then you get to a conference and say, yay, we did it. We fought for those obvious life-saving measures. They're expanding. Great. But how can you not look at a chart that says, but more people are dying than ever, and say, well, I wonder what else we could, at the least say, I wonder what else we could do, or what's going wrong? Because it just still seems like there's such a fight. There's so much to fight for. You've already accepted that there's, that's the motivation part. You've already accepted there's motivation to keep running with that story and not expand it, because there's still work to be done.
And one reason that I'm acutely aware of, it's what my memoir is about, my lonely quest to change advocacy. If everybody around you believes something, you believe it. That's reality. Yeah. I mean, the hell with that goddamn chart that I just put up. Everybody in this room believes this other thing. Good enough, because really human beings, ironically, I mean, it's the same thing that killed, the Glee star and called Brendan the football player. The people you're with are your reality. And some people's reality, and going back to hillbilly elegy, is life-defying. It's not going to make it's okay to say, well, it's good to believe in, Kentucky has home values as well. But if you're going to die, that's not adding up in the correct way. And taking that to a higher level, we have people in drug policy who adhere to a set of values that everybody agrees on, but people are dying. In general, it's not them and their children. even in bad cases like Madeline Dean, they're probably going to end up on top of the pile because they're top of the pile people. She was a professor before she was a congresswoman. Her husband's a successful businessman. People like that in general have a better prognosis. And so it's not only possible, but natural to be blinded to the larger reality by your local reality, your personal reality. That's just the way people are. You must observe this whenever there's some debate about the 12 steps. People always write in the same thing. Oh, I went to 12 steps and it didn't work, or I went to the 12 steps and it did work. That's the reality. You can't argue with that. And they believe that. But at some level, we're supposed to figure out, well, peach pits don't really cure AIDS. Somebody's job is to kind of add all these teacups up and come up with something that works. So we, in our modest little way, we've spoken about this before. It's becoming a little bit more activated. We have a colleague, one of our coaches, a man named Aaron Ferguson, a man who, my favorite quote from Aaron when I asked him in an interview with you, are you traumatized? He just laughs. And he says, oh, I've had plenty of trauma, but I'm not traumatized, which is, Aaron's life, they would reject it as a movie because it just had too many crazy things happen in it. Nobody will believe this.
Right. Can't even make it up.
He's actively engaged with an organ. People don't realize the MAT is now, people are against big pharma. MAT is big pharma. And I'm not against or for big pharma. I don't care about big pharma. But big pharma is now pushing Suboxone. And the way that works, people pay money for it and people use it and they get money for it. And so the question becomes, how do we combine? What we've been saying is the danger in external therapies is that you subvert people's self-efficacy.
Right.
And just going straight to the common sense level, we say, obviously, if it's going to prevent some people from dying, because if you're taking Suboxone or Methadone, you're not going to overdose on whatever the hell they were taking. Keith was taking, he had heroin and alcohol in the system, and it's a bad combination sometimes. Cole Brennan had whatever he probably wasn't taking fentanyl. He was taking something else that had fentanyl in it. So what we're about is, how do you give something that can be safety providing without it depriving them of their sense of self-empowerment?
That's tricky.
But
it needs to be done. I mean, that's the logical next step forward.
And I mean, Aaron has a quick way of doing. We call what we do the Empowerment Life Process Program MAT model. I mean, without even trying, our coaches deal with people who've been on MAT because that's just everywhere. B, among the things I've learned from Aaron is human beings are human beings. And a lot of people don't like being on Suboxone or Methadone, and you know that. And so he informed us that on their own, maybe half of the people after 2 years, kick Suboxone, or they do it on their own because a lot of people have a tendency or a trend to want to be free. And so the essential issue is, how do you see MAT as a tool and not as the be all and end all? That's the goal, to make use of something that has a potential and allow people to use it or encourage them, as the case may be, as a tool, hopefully voluntarily, but for them to recognize that they're still the tool user.
I was this is maybe a non sequitur, but it coincides with the themes that we've been running with. I remember reading literature when I knew nothing. I had no interest in talking about theory about drugs addiction, how to improve people's lives in that realm. And then I got interested in it. And I got interested in it because of my own story, which I thought was I just kind of kicked the drug on my own. So I thought that was like revelatory. And then I started reading literature from DPA, from Maya Szalavitz, and that really helped me to understand the concept of helping human beings a little bit more, and away from the standard mainstream media sort of model of things. The problem was that
so DBA and Maya kind of are going down that road, and then they halt.
That's exactly what I was about to say. I love critical thinking. I can't stop doing it. It's a slog. I get stuck in a bog once in a while, and then I have to realize I'm probably thinking about something wrong. And so how do I do that? And that's critical thinking 101. You want to move on from where you feel like you're getting stuck, and you got to be a little honest. I'm not perfect at it, but you need to be honest about what your own confirmation biases are, and why you might be reinforcing your own bad behavior, and step back from it. I love that. And I think that that's what you're saying, is that we're stuck not being critical thinkers anymore. At one time, this is progressive and a critical thinking sort of push forward. People have gotten kind of comfy with the ideology, and it's not very comfortable to think beyond or to attack your own.
You can buy it in a package by putting a coin in a slot machine, and it comes out all together.
Yeah.
In Outgrowing Addiction, we list a set of values that enable people to avoid or overcome addiction. And being healthy is one. Being frugal, because it's hard to come up with an addiction that doesn't cost you a lot of useless money. Mm-hmm. Two others. One is welcoming thinking. You might call it critical thinking. I personally, and entertainment for me, and I realized this during the pandemic, when you're allowed to sort of roam around and sit outdoors. Everything's outdoors now in New York. I can sit at a table and look at people walk by for a long time. I used to have a friend, Mark Rosenthal, is a big art curator in Philly, and we used to hitchhike to New York and sit in Hector's cafeteria and just look at people and say, I wonder what they're up to. And we would spend hours doing that. They had free sick pickles and free seltzer. And so intoxication is of limited value to me. I welcome thinking. And one other thing that kind of will always help, I think, is a value on achievement. And this is one of the trickiest issues in dealing with privileged people. In general, privileged kids have their own problems, and people recognize them. They're competing for a few slots to go to Yale and Harvard. They're tense and they're anxious. But I was reading about the daughter of Les Moonves, who was the head of, I think, CBS, but he got Me Too'd. And his daughter now co-manages a chain of restaurants. And the way that happened was she got some kind of degree. I don't know these facts exactly. Like, she went to BU and got a communications at Boston University, got a communications degree. And so a guy, some famous chef, decided to start a restaurant. And he said, why don't I hire her? And I'm guessing he's thinking, the fact that her father's head of CBS, maybe that helps. And so she did the PR stuff, and then they had an opening night. She showed up, and they didn't have enough wait staff, enough cleanup staff. And so even though she's a rich girl, by any standard, we call her spoiled, she started cleaning up tables. Now, why would she do that? There's sort of the privileged, motif, but then there's the achievement motif that people often in high performance places learn, which is, you got to make this work. Your job is to succeed, and yet have to do whatever it takes to succeed. And that has downsides in certain situations, but that's called achievement motivation. And, when you look at people who got better, you look at Johann Hari and Maya Szalavitz and Mark Lewis and Carl Hart. Well, Carl Hart was never addicted. They're all achievement people. I mean, they're all people that had this drive to be successful. And so, among the values that, are thoughtfulness, mindfulness, the opposite of unconsciousness, and a value to want to succeed and to perform well and to make some kind of contribution to Earth. So again, we're back to talking common sense. And we believe that people have that ability in them, and sometimes they've lost it, or sometimes they've been discouraged. But you're only going to have a world. I mean, of course, we're back to, what's Vance? What's his first initials? Hillbilly Ellis?
JD Vance.
JD Vance was the achievement guy, and he lived like a coal mining daughter's life. But, he did well at school. And his biggest complaint was he was working at a auto parts store, and a guy there whose girlfriend was pregnant didn't come in every day, but he had a cell phone because he got some kind of payment for the child. And Vance is going, wait a second, you have to work to make the money.
Yeah.
To have a cell phone. So, we're only talking common sense. We're only talking basic human values. We're only talking your belief in yourself, your belief in certain positive outlooks in the earth. And our ability as a society to create those options is our only solution for addiction and drug deaths.
That was a full episode today. I think that was excellent.
Beginning to end.
Yeah.
A salute, and it ties into what we're trying to do with Life Process Program. Hopefully there'll be more news about our LPP MAT concept.
Thank you so much, Stanton.